This video is going to provide a brief introduction to Paul and to the teaching that we can find in his letters. Now, as we said in class, Paul was a very successful missionary. So he founded and taught different Christian communities all around the Mediterranean, pretty much the entire known world to people who lived there at the time. And he was successful for a number of different reasons. First of all, almost everyone spoke Greek, and Paul did as well. So just about everywhere that he went, he could speak Greek, people could understand him. Also at this time, the Roman peace, or Pax Romana, was in effect. So that meant that Paul didn't have to worry about traveling through any war-torn territory or traveling through any area of fighting. He could travel all around the Mediterranean region, all around the Roman Empire, safely. Third, there were Jewish communities, the diaspora, set up in large cities. So as a Jew, Paul could get to town, go to a synagogue, and find people willing to give him a place to stay, some jobs to do, and give him some time to preach in the synagogue. So those are kind of the outside conditions that led to Paul's success. But Paul also had a number of personal characteristics that made him successful as well. So as a Jew, he spoke Hebrew and was steeped in the Jewish tradition, was a very learned Jew. So he had instant access to Jewish communities. He could also read and speak Greek. He was a Roman citizen, so he was comfortable with Gentiles as well. And he could tailor a message to a particular audience and make his message easy to understand. So if he was talking to Jews, he could talk about things that they were concerned about. If he was talking to Gentiles, he could talk to them about things that they were concerned about. And then finally, he was energetic. Think of the number of years that Paul traveled and the distances that Paul traveled. It takes a lot of energy to be able to do that when not everyone is willing to listen to your message, not everyone is willing to have you stick around and preach. So Paul's energy definitely contributed to his success as well. Okay, so here's what happens. When Paul arrives in a new place, first he goes to the local synagogue. As a Jew, he's got kind of instant connections there. And as part of the synagogue service, there was almost open mic time. But Paul would use that time to get up and address the local assembly. You know, hello, my name is Paul, come from Tarsus, I'm a Pharisee, but I want to tell all of you about this great guy named Jesus. I'll be out back at the end of the service if you'd like to talk to me. And Paul would do this every day. And then eventually the synagogue leadership would get kind of annoyed and would drive Paul from the synagogue. Now remember I said Paul was energetic? Well, Paul didn't give up here. Paul instead took his message to the Gentiles of the town. So he would go to the local market, go to the town square. Hello, my name is Paul. I'm here to tell all of you Gentiles about Jesus. And when Paul got a group of people that were interested in hearing about Jesus, hearing what he had to say, they would begin a local church. These local churches usually met in a wealthy person's home, and that person would become a leader of the local church. So, Paul is showing a bit of kind of pragmatism there too, making sure that he's making connections with people who have both the time, the money, and the space to be able to support that local church when he's not there anymore. And so he would stay for a while to establish that church, make sure they were kind of well underway, and after a few months he would move on. And when people had questions or problems, those church leaders would write to Paul, and Paul would reply back with letters of his own. Now this slide's a little blurry. You don't have it in your notes, but this just shows you the books of the New Testament. And remember, when we're talking about letters, we're not talking about the Gospels or Acts of the Apostles or Revelation. We're talking about the other 21 books. And we can divide those into letters that have some kind of connection to Paul, and then this picture calls general, but we also call Catholic or universal letters. And it's really important to remember that Paul's letters are part of two-way conversations. So with the exception to just a couple letters that are in the Bible that Paul wrote, Paul was responding. So, imagine an email conversation with a friend where you've gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You're just getting one of those messages, but we can also learn a lot about these different Christian communities based on what Paul's writing about. So if Paul is saying, "Oh, I'm here to answer, I'm writing to answer these questions," then we can assume that Paul had gotten a letter from that community asking some questions about the topics that Paul is responding to. And as the communities got these letters, they would share them between different communities. "Oh, we got this great letter from Paul about this subject. You guys should read this." So a number of those letters in the Christian Testament are known as Pauline letters. And they're called Pauline because they have some sort of connection to Paul. But we're pretty sure, biblical scholars are pretty sure, that Paul did not write all of the letters that are called Pauline letters. So we can divide the Pauline letters into at least three different categories. We can talk about letters that were definitely written by Paul, like 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, the Corinthians letters, and letters to the Romans. We can also talk about letters that were possibly written by Paul. So if they were written at one time, they were written by Paul. If they were written at a different time, then they weren't written by Paul. They were written by, one of his disciples. And then we have letters like 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus that were most likely not written by Paul. They were written by kind of followers of Paul. We can also divide these Pauline letters into kind of the early letters, great letters, prison letters, and pastoral letters. And in the Bible, the Pauline letters are organized longest to shortest. So Paul's letter to the Romans is the longest of the Pauline letters. So that one comes right after Acts of the Apostles. And you go all the way down to, the letter to either Philemon or Philemon. That's like 2 pages long. So now let's talk briefly about how Paul's letters were set up. Paul's letters always begin with some sort of opening. So talking about, from whom is this letter coming? So Paul or, whoever is with him, whoever is kind of co-authoring that letter with him, who the recipients are. There's some sort of formulaic greeting. So Paul usually uses this combination of Greek and Jewish words, so grace and peace. So think about, if his letters were going to Jewish Christian communities or Gentile communities, grace and peace hits them both. Then Paul's letters include a section of thanksgiving or blessing. So, gratitude for goodness that people have shown in the past. He's giving thanks to God for something about the recipient. So, I give thanks for your good energy. I give thanks for your faith and love. But when Paul's angry, he skips that part. So that's a good way to tell, what kind of letter you're receiving, if Paul gives thanks to God for you or not. The main section of Paul's letter is the letter body. Usually these have 2 different sections, doctrinal, so kind of ideas about God, Jesus, church, and instructional, kind of telling the community how to live. In a lot of these letters, those 2 sections are kind of woven together. So Paul will kind of begin the body with an initial statement, kind of a thesis, and then have some theological discussions, and then talk about the ethical implications. But most of his letters have this body. And then finally, we have a conclusion. So Paul will talk about kind of practical matters, so, any news from another community, any words of advice. Sometimes he'll talk about, this letter was written by my own hand, special greetings to so-and-so. And then he usually ends with a final blessing or prayer. And something like, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. So again, Paul returning to that idea of grace. In our next class, we'll take a look at some of Paul's letters and see how they follow this formula. See you then.